Hello, this is Joey Adams, and thank you for joining me as we explore Christianity's impact on the civil rights movement. Due to limited time, I cannot go into detail about everyone I would want to. However, I felt that it was necessary to talk about some lesser known people as well as some names that you are familiar with. So once more, thank you for joining us on this presentation of the American Cry for Freedom.
Let's begin with speaking about slavery and abolition. There were many abolitionists that felt a calling from their faith to try to help people who were in bondage. However, a little bit before the abolitionist movement really started to take off, we had people like George Whitefield who would teach slaves how to read. While Whitefield was a slave owner, he contradicted many slave owners at the time. Reading for the slaves was something that was outlawed, something that you shouldn't do. However, Whitefield felt that if these people were to be saved, they had to know how to read themselves. So while not an abolitionist, helping people learn how to read helped eventually push that movement on, because a man that can read is a man that has power. However, even in the time of the Great Awakening, there were people like Hopkins that was purely anti-slavery. One man that used his literacy to great effect was Frederick Douglass, and sometimes that literacy was used to condemn the issues that he saw.
For the Christianity of Christ and the Christianity displayed in this country, I find the widest most different. To accept one as pure and just, you must reject the other as evil and wicked. To be friend to one must mean you are the enemy to the other.
The people who fought for civil rights using Christianity came from many walks of life. And many times we think of the only voice coming from the pulpit, but sometimes it came from the choir. And a good case of this is with Mahalia Jackson. Miss Jackson was seen at many different civil rights events. Her voice became synonymous with the movement, even singing with Martin Luther King Jr. on his march to Washington. However, there were also people who used Christianity and were from places like jazz. For example, John Coltrane.
You know, God breathes through us completely. However, there's so much that we don't even feel it. Heck, my spiritual expression is displayed in my music. It's my faith. It's my being. It's my everything.
Coltrane's faith would be put to the test after the 16th Street church bombing. This was a bombing that killed 4 young girls as they prepared for service. In response to this, he released a song called Alabama. Alabama was a huge step for civil rights because it said what everyone was feeling without a word of dialogue in his song. Many times, an attack on the church is an attack on civil rights, since the church and civil rights go hand in hand. We saw this in Charleston when a person filled with hate came into a church service and gunned down 9 people in Mother Emanuel Church. In fact, 100 years before, the church was burnt down because people assumed that there was a slave revolt started from the church. An accomplished architect named Denmark Vesey were among 35 people who were killed. After slavery, things were not all well. For instance, we had things such as Plessy versus Ferguson. What this ruling says is basically segregation was legal as long as everything was equal, but things were never really equal. Then we had Jim Crow laws. Plessy versus Ferguson was eventually struck down by the efforts of Thurgood Marshall, and many people helped to take down the Jim Crow laws. And when it came to fighting these laws, many of the people who were in the forefront were preachers. For example, you had organizations like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This was a group of preachers, reverends, and the like that was opposed to segregation. However, at the same time, all churches were not fully on board with desegregation. These issues stretch all the way back to the Civil War. Mark Noll wrote a book called The Civil War as a Theology in Crisis. And this explained how many churches down south supported slavery and the South in the Civil War. The power of the black church is something that people have studied for a while. One of the first people was W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois was an African American sociologist. He really saw racism firsthand when he moved down south to Atlanta University. We see him start to explore racism in the church in his book, The Negro Church. This was one of the first cases where the church was actually studied in a scientific manner. Du Bois really wanted to push the idea of leaders of the church being leaders of the black community. He knew what power these people had for racial economic uplift. He believed that their role would be essential in African Americans gaining their freedoms. And in many ways, we can see that he was correct. Another book that he wrote that had a lot of sway was called The Souls of Black Folk. And here, this is an example of him uplifting the black preachers. For example, in a section called The Faith of Our Fathers, we see him lifting up many different African American preachers, from McNeil Turner to Alexander Cromwell. However, at the same time, he did attack those preachers who would tell people to just sit and wait. Sit and wait mindset, the battle between waiting and pushing for change now, would be something that would lead him to have conflict with another person who pushed for black rights, and this was Booker T. Washington. Later in life, Du Bois would go on to move to Ghana in Western Africa, and he sadly died one day before the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech. I often wonder what would his viewpoint be of that speech. Du Bois lived through many different eras of changing freedoms, so I wonder how he would view things differently than a younger person at the time. There were many preachers who had a massive effect on African Americans. From Henry Hosier, he was a famous African American preacher during the Second Awakening. His speaking skills helped to show that African Americans could also do this. Then we had Richard Allen, the founder of the AME Church, and so many more that we just cannot name. However, one of the people who had the most impact in the modern era was Martin Luther King Jr. He was born in Atlanta in a church family. King was big on what they called then the social gospel. King was thrown into the limelight when he was just 26 years old. That is when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat in Montgomery, Alabama. He didn't necessarily want to take a leadership role, but he was asked and he said, okay. However, death threats kept coming, and at one point he was going to step away, but he felt a calling from God to stay put, and then his house was firebombed, but yet he stayed put. He was pushed the idea of fighting hate with love, being non-violent to those who will be violent to you. This led to arrests and all sorts of other things. King was involved in many things. In fact, he was involved in many things that we have spoken about in the modern era. When the bombs went off in the church in Alabama, he gave the eulogy. He was also a leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Council.
As we come to the end, let's remember some of the stuff that we went over. Small names making a big impact, like Harry Hosier. And then people that we wouldn't even imagine, jazzmen playing the songs of freedom. We have people who stand out in things like Plessy versus Ferguson. And lastly, we looked at a theology that was thrown into crisis because of this issue. Again, things are still changing, but know that this story of the civil rights movement isn't a black thing, it's an American thing, because it took all Americans to push towards freedom. This has been Joey Adams, and this has also been the American Cry for Freedom.
Soon this life will all be over, and our pilgrim journey will end. Soon we'll